Hey, how you doing? Justin here. Today we are checking out string bending for blues guitar. Now this is a really important lesson because string bending is such an important part of the blues language, and if you get it right and you learn it right, it'll really add a great dimension to your blues playing that you'll never have if you don't learn to string bend properly. So we're going to be looking a lot at the technique, and the technique is really important. It's actually pretty simple, and when you get it right it becomes really easy, but when you've getting it wrong it can feel really frustrating and like, oh, I can't do this, I'll never get it. But you've got to practice it. For nearly everyone I've ever taught this to, they've found it really difficult to begin with, really struggled with it, but kept practicing, and then suddenly you go, oh yeah, it feels right, I got it. And when you do that, it's such a rewarding feeling. So do bear with it if it feels a little bit tricky when you first start. It's quite normal for it to be difficult, okay? But it really is persistence and practice are the really key ingredients here. Now, it's really important that you realize as well that string bending is about getting a note in tune, okay? If you don't get your note in tune, it sounds pretty horrible. Any of you that have heard a child learning to play violin, right? That's out of tune. On guitar, if your guitar is in tune, you can't play a note out of tune unless you string bend or use a whammy bar, because we've got frets. Okay, you can play a bad note by being on the wrong fret, but otherwise you're not going to get yourself out of tune. And it's really important that you learn to bend in tune. I'm going to be showing you some exercises on that, but it's really big deal. It's also important to realize that you only bend specific notes. It's not like you learn bending technique and you just apply it randomly to any note, because you're bending from one note to another note. Okay, I'm going to say that again. It's really important. When you string bend, you're bending from one note to another note. So there are particular notes that bend really well, and I'm going to show you all of those right in a close-up very soon. So there are two key elements that I want you to remain aware of at all times when you're learning to do string bending. And the first one is that you always bend with more than one finger. Now there are some examples later on, and you'll see Eric Clapton occasionally do first finger bends. There's plenty of time for that, but when you start out, you're going to be doing all of your string bending with the third finger supported by the second finger, maybe even the first finger as well. Okay, really big deal. Always be using more than one finger. The second thing that's really important, and the kind of the key to the whole technique, is that you learn to use your arm and your wrist, not your fingers. Okay, the muscles in your fingers themselves are very small, and bending like this, like when you think your fingers are pointing up, bending like that and trying to use the little muscles in your fingers is incredibly difficult compared to being able to use your whole arm. Okay, so actually we're going to be creating a pivot here at the edge of the knuckle of the first finger, and we're going to be using the whole arm to do the string bend. I'm exaggerating it now, and as you play more and more, you're going to find that the movement is a bit more subtle than the way I show it to you at the beginning. But I really want you to think about making these big movements at the start, because it'll give you the right technique. And once you've got the right technique, you can refine it and make it smaller and more comfortable. But at the beginning, you really want to be thinking about these big movements. So let's get to a close-up and check out this technique. Okay, so to start off with here, I want to explain the actual mechanics of doing a string bend, because once you get this, it makes the whole thing a lot easier. So I want you to start off by putting the edge of your first finger, right, where that first finger is meeting the hand, at the 5th fret, right where the metal is, maybe a little bit forward of it, okay? So you can see there, it's where your hand is meeting the guitar neck, okay? Pop it down, and then I want you to fold the hand so little finger, where it meets the hand, is now touching the guitar neck, okay? So we're making this motion. Okay, it's really big deal. Thumb is just kind of resting over the top. It's important as well that it's over the top. Don't try and have it behind. So just over the top, but it's not really gripping anything particularly solidly. Okay, and get used to that motion, because it's actually, that's the mechanics that we're using to do the string bending. You can feel it's your whole arm, right? Your hand and your forearm are nice and flat, and you're just using this folding motion. Okay, you're using your whole arm. Now, the next step, so you can see actually how we do the string bending in an exaggerated way, is to fold the fingers forward. Okay, so we've left the hand and the arm, the forearm, all of that, we've just folded the fingers forward. But when we do the motion now, you can see how we can use that mechanic to do the string bend. Okay, it's exaggerating it, it's way exaggerating it. Okay, it's not like this in real life, but that's the motion. So spend a little bit of time doing that and getting used to where the pressure comes from, because it's almost like here This is what's doing the string bend. This is locked. This is your pivot point. And it's this motion. Even you can press against your little finger there a bit and push your hand up toward the fingerboard. That gives you a bit of a feeling of the resistance of the string. Okay, that's the motion. It's pressing against that. Okay, try and get used to that. Spend a little bit of time just doing that, making sure that it really feels right to you. Okay, then what I want you to do is fold the third finger onto the 8th fret of the 2nd string, and then back it up with the 2nd finger in the 7th fret. Now, sometimes 3rd finger might kind of slide forward into the 8th fret, that's cool, but just to start off with, 3rd finger in the 8th fret of the 2nd string, 2nd finger behind it, 7th fret, still on the 2nd string, okay? Now, thumb is over the top, fingers are down, probably put the 1st finger down as well in the 6th fret. You don't have to, we're not really using that one for the actual power for the bend, but it's comfortable for it to sit there. And then I want you to see if you can make that same motion. Okay, just relax the finger so that it's kind of on the string but not pressing it down. See if you can use that feeling. Right, can you see there? I'm not actually doing a string bend yet. I've just kind of lifted it off the string ever so slightly, and now I'm making that motion. It's still this. Still that pressure from the little finger. I've just folded my fingers over. They're slightly round now. The fingers are round and locked together as well. Can you see that the fingers are locked together at an angle? It's not this. Trying to bend like this is bending with the finger muscles. You can see now my forearm isn't moving at all, and that's not right. Okay, it's really difficult to bend like that. There's a few guys that do it, but very, very few. None of the great guys like you, Albert King and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Eric Clapton and all of those guys. They're all bending like this. Okay, so 3rd finger's down, then have a go at doing a string bend. Just try it. So put your 3rd finger down, use that pressure here from the little finger to push up. And you can see already it's a lot smaller movement. It's not this. Okay, that's exaggerating it, but it's the right, you've got to get that feeling to do the string bend. Okay, so then just have a little go. So go to play the note and bend it. Don't worry about being in tune yet, you're just worrying about the mechanics. Okay, you're going to see all these other funny notes ringing out and stuff, that's fine. Don't worry about it. You're just right now, you're really working on trying to get that feeling. Okay, the pivot from the 1st finger. Okay, you're going to find it very hard to bend very far yet. Don't be worrying about doing that. Just little bends, just making sure that you get the mechanics right. At this point, the mechanics are so important. It's the biggest deal. Once you feel you've got that mechanics right, it's now time to try and bend one in tune. So the one that I recommend that you start off with is where we were just starting there, which is the 8th fret of the 2nd string with the 3rd finger. Sound like the note 2 frets higher. That's the 10th fret. Okay, so you're going to play that note, play the 10th fret, go back, and then bend so you get that same pitch. Okay, so you're trying to make it go da, ba, ba, ba. That's what you're going for. Use your 3rd finger for all of the notes. Okay, try, really try and imagine, that's the note. Okay, you might find you sometimes over bending a bit. Oops, that was a bit far or not enough. Okay, can you hear that that's not right? That's it. I've heard people talk about using a guitar tuner to get themselves in tune, but I think you're better off learning to use your ears. Okay? You've got to learn to hear whether it's in tune, because you're sure not going to be using your tuner on stage when you're playing your licks, right? Nice and slowly this. Over and over and again. Just making sure you get that bend right. Going to talk about some of the problems in a second, but first of all I want to show you the other notes that you should be bending. So that's the first one that I would recommend that you practice working on. The second one I'd recommend that you go for is actually the 7th fret of the 3rd string, and it's again a tone bend. Okay, again, Really concentrating on the mechanics. Mechanics is most important at this stage. 7th fret, 3rd finger still backed up by the 2nd finger, 1st finger's on, but it doesn't have to be. Play the 9th fret, back to the 7th fret, and then do your bend up to the correct pitch. You can see I hardly have to move anything there. It's a very small movement, but it's really important that that's the motion, that you're using that pivot. Now, exercise 3 I'd recommend is doing the same thing, but this time only bending a semitone. Okay, so 1 fret. Very small movement now. Over and over again. Maybe moving to the tone. Then back to a semitone. And when you finish that, the last one that I'd recommend and the last bend that's really good from this minor pentatonic scale is here, the 8th fret of the thinnest string, up 2 frets, back, bend. Okay, again, really important. You got that sound in your head. Concentrate on getting it in tune. Now, there's quite a few problems that are very, very common with string bending. The first one, the most common one, is getting notes ringing out as you bring the bend down. Now, it's really important that you understand that the bend is just going up and that we usually don't want the string coming down. Okay, so it's possible to go up and down. Okay, but most times we want to go up and then we're going to play another note. Do you hear? We're not hearing that note coming down. We're not hearing, it's just up. So how on earth am I doing that? Well, the trick is actually in the picking hand, okay? So this here is the big deal, is the way that we use the picking hand to touch all of the strings after the bend. So we bend the string up, then this hand touches all the strings and mutes them, then we release the bend, okay? It's a really, really big deal. If you get used to not doing that, you end up with these sort of seagulls, or bending. You get these little kind of funny half bends down. It just sounds bad. Bend, mute, release. Bend, mute, release. Bend, mute, release. Bend, mute, release. Now this also gets rid of the other very common problem, which is this: when you get other notes ringing out. Hear those other notes ringing out? Okay, the other strings are being activated by the finger coming down. If I don't pick it, you can hear them very clearly ringing out. So having this mute going before you release it is really, really important. If you're doing a bend and release, then you have to use your hand to cover just the strings you don't want to ring out. Okay, it takes a little bit more practice. The other sneaky trick that we use here quite often as well is the first finger, rather than being right on the string, is actually just resting up a little bit to mute the 3rd string. Okay, so even though I'm doing a bend on the 2nd string, when I release, the first finger is just touching the 3rd string to mute it, because that's the one that would be most likely to ring out if I not do it. I'm trying to take my hand right away there, so I'm not. You can hear it's kind of flicking the string as the bend comes down. Okay? You don't want to have that really, so you want to get into the habit of trying to mute the bend, okay, and then releasing it. Okay, that's a really common blues lick. Mute, release, play, play. Okay, so that's probably the biggest deal, is going to be this string muting after you've done the bend and avoiding the, I call them seagulls. Okay, so you want to avoid that. Sometimes you'll do it deliberately, but you want to be able to avoid it at the beginning, especially for these first licks. Okay, one thing that I get asked about quite often is whether the strings should be going over or under the fingers, and the truth is actually they should be in the middle. Now, I can't actually make it happen here because my action is not high enough, but I guess if you had a really high action, it would be possible for the strings to kind of go up over, you know, for the strings to go, rather fingers to go under the strings. I can't make that happen, but I gather some people can actually have that. So, and more commonly, if you've got a very low action, is for the strings to fall under the fingers as you bend, for that third finger to slip under. I can't even make myself do it now because I'm so trained not to, but it's to get this effect where you end up with grabbing more than one string. But really the truth is that you should be kind of having your finger there in such a way that the strings they're touching the third and second finger, but they're not actually getting pressed down. So if I play them, they're kind of half getting pressed down. But I also get a lot of questions about fingers hurting when you're doing string bending, and there's no question that when you're doing string bending really works the skin off your fingers. And if I'm doing like a Stevie Ray Vaughan track and spending a lot of time practicing it, the skin on the ends of my fingers just wears off, and I have to stop playing eventually. So do expect that a little bit. The more you play, the stronger the calluses will get. But if you don't go too mental with your string bending when you first learn it. 5 minutes a day kind of thing should be about the most that you're really spending on dedicated bending practice, because you'll probably even find that much will start to really hurt your fingers. I've heard people complain that the skin is starting to pull away from the nail there. That sounds terrible. I've never had that, and I'm not sure what to suggest, except making sure that you're not pressing down too hard with the fingers, and so that the fingers are touching the wood, because when you're doing a string bend, the fingers should be touching the string, but not the wood on the fingerboard. They might touch it a little bit, but they shouldn't be pressing on it enough that it's forcing the skin back off your fingers, that's for certain. It's also worth noting that the lighter strings you use, the easier it is to do string bending. So if you're really struggling, you might want to explore using a 9-gauge string, okay? I like using 10s. A lot of the greatest blues guitar players used very heavy strings, like Stevie Ray Vaughan used 12s or 13s. That makes it very, very hard to bend the strings because they're so thick. So if you're struggling at this stage, you might want to consider using 9s for a little while you develop the technique, because once you've got the technique, it's actually a lot easier. It's not as hard as it looks at first. It feels difficult. I still remember really finding it awkward and painful, but it's not really when you get the technique right. So it's all about developing that pivot. One other question I get asked quite often is about string bending on an acoustic guitar. Now, it is possible to do string bending on an acoustic guitar. It's just a lot more difficult, usually because the strings are thicker. So if you have an acoustic guitar and you really want to get into blues lead guitar, then you might want to explore using very, very light strings, like 9s or even 8s possibly, just to make it kind of possible. Once you develop a good technique, you'll find that you can do string bending on an acoustic guitar, but I think learning the technique itself on an acoustic is not such a good idea. Most of this course is going to be electric based, because really blues lead guitar is generally kind of an electric form. It's perfectly possible on acoustic guitar, it's just not as common, and I do recommend if you want to get into blues lead guitar that you're doing it on an electric guitar. Now you're going to find these exercises, the 4 exercises that I recommend, on the website, as well as a little neck diagram which shows you which are the notes that are really good to bend, because as you're learning blues guitar you're going to find there are certain notes in each different pattern that are really good for string bending, and you probably want to stick with those to start off with. It's possible to use the other ones, but there's just very specific techniques that you have to use to be able to use them effectively and musically and not make yourself out of tune or playing a bad note. So really important that you focus on your tuning and your technique. They're the two things, the key element for learning to do string bending, is making sure that you're using that pivot, right? Really, there's no harm in doing a bit of practice like that and just really making sure that you're using your arm and not your fingers. Very, very big deal. As soon as you feel confident with that, it's all about getting it in tune. Okay, making sure that you do that exercises exactly as I showed you. Remember, there's tab on the website that you can use as a reference. Play the note you're bending to, go back and then do the string bend. Okay, over and over again until you get it in tune every time. That's what you want to be able to do the string bend and it goes in tune. You don't have to be listening for it every time, because often if a lick's kind of complicated, you don't have time to listen for whether it's in tune, but it'll sound a bit weird if it's not in tune. Okay, so lots and lots of repetition. Remember, practice makes permanent. Practice doesn't make perfect with string bending. If you practice doing it out of tune a lot, you're going to make doing it out of tune permanent. and that's bad. So really slowly, really carefully, really in tune, over and over again. Make sure that you're getting it right. Make sure you're getting it in tune. Make sure you're using the right technique, and you're going to find it loads of fun. The very next lesson we're going to be doing is learning some licks, some words. You're going to be learning some words to start putting into practice and making up your own solos. But pretty much all of the licks are using string bending. So do make sure you give quite a good amount of time to making sure that you get the technique right and that you're in tune before you join me for the next lesson. You take care of yourselves. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.